Welcome to Path to Prosperity, the podcast from Saskatchewan Economic Development Alliance. I'm Crystal Froese. On this podcast, we explore ideas, partnerships, and leaderships shaping stronger communities. And today, we're diving into one of the most important concepts shaping the future of economic development: economic ecosystems. While the term might be becoming more common, what does it actually mean, and how can communities intentionally build one? To answer those questions, today I'm going to be joined by one of Canada's leading voices on the topic, Dallas Gislason. He's the Executive Director of the South Island Prosperity Partnership. And for more than 20 years, Dallas has been helping communities build stronger regional economies through collaboration, innovation, and shared leadership. Under his leadership, the South Island Prosperity Partnership has become one of Canada's leading regional economic alliances. The organization helped launch Coast Pacific Canada's leading ocean economy hub, supporting the creation of more than 500 direct jobs and establishing Blue Action Canada, the country's first dedicated ocean tech accelerator. They've also advanced economic reconciliation through the creation of the Indigenous Prosperity Centre, which supports Indigenous-led economic initiatives and grows the South Island Indigenous Business Directory, and host events like the Indigenous Youth Economic Conference. Dallas holds a Master of Global Management from Royal Roads University, a graduate certificate in economic development from the University of Waterloo, and professional certifications in business retention and expansion, industry cluster facilitation, and organizational performance. We are going to tackle a lot in this conversation. So sit back and let's jump right in to my discussion with Dallas as we explore what economic ecosystems are and why they matter, and what Saskatchewan can learn from regions that are intentionally building them. Welcome, Dallas. I am so excited to be able to have a great conversation with you here today. Let's just start off with the real simple explanation for our listeners. When we talk about an economic ecosystem, like in ordinary plain language, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, so first of all, just thanks for having me, inviting me on, and to Verona and SEDA. And I'm from Saskatchewan, so it's a pleasure to speak to you today. Yeah, so I guess an economic ecosystem, to me, I guess the simplest way to think about it is the difference between a regional economy, which is more about like behavior and commuter sheds and stuff like that, and an ecosystem, which is, if you use the literal definition of ecosystem from nature, where you have, think of it like a forest with like big trees and small shrubs and like fungi and a stream and a water source and like all these different types of things that create this symbiosis together and feed off each other to make each other thrive, right? So an economic ecosystem is just that. It's the idea that you have, say, like a large employer or a major driving industry sector, and then you have a main street and retail and the secondary, tertiary type of industries. And both of those things are needed to actually create an ecosystem. And then to add to that is you think about all of the different partners and roles that can be played in nurturing that ecosystem. And those partners and organizations are all part of that ecosystem. So things like banks and financial institutions, or private capital investment, or, like economic development organizations, or municipal governments, or all levels of government, right? You can have First Nations governments involved, and you can have provincial ministries or programming involved. And then you could have specialized banks like FCC or Business Development Bank or EDC, et cetera. And all of those partners all come together to create this ecosystem play, if you will, of symbiosis.
It's kind of like the ingredient, but the more important thing than just having the right players, it's about connecting them and aligning them.
Yeah, exactly. So like another way to think of it too is if an ecosystem, if you, just like in nature, if you take out one of the ingredients in that healthy ecosystem, then the whole ecosystem starts to collapse, right? And there's that famous fable about the Yellowstone Park where they went in and killed all the wolves, and then all of a sudden you had like an overrun of the other animals that were like literally changing the health of the environment, and then they added the wolves back in, and it literally changed the ecosystem and created this equilibrium, if you will. And that's not unlike how economic ecosystems work, is that, you have the larger employers, and sometimes in economic development is we tend to chase after these like big sort of, we call it smokestack chasing, when really the existing employers are part of the health of where the ecosystem is today, and making sure that we're nurturing the workforce and providing the capital and the other inputs that those existing ecosystem partners need to thrive at all levels, right? Small, retail, all the way up.
Yeah, so that's a great illustration. So talking about the word nurture, because you don't often think about nurture in the context of economic growth and that. So how important would be sharing the data and maybe trust and governance just make the ecosystem actually function right down to nitty gritty of how that actually looks?
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot because obviously I work in a regional alliance model in economic development here in BC. And sometimes people ask the question is like, hey, why do we even need this thing to exist? Like, why do this work and this mandate and run these programs and stuff? And I try to turn that back on the opposite way, which is to think of what happens if we just decided not to nurture the economy at all.
Huh.
And the economy is this force, like this invisible force that just sort of happens. There's human behavior, there's commerce, there's people spending money and buying things, and that just stuff just all happens anyways. And so the question is, why nurture it? I talked to our stakeholders about this, is that if you think about an economy, how it functions today, is you want to look at sort of a future vision state for like what would an ideal economy look like, and things that you could think about like an inclusive economy and wealth distribution and good paying jobs and good career entry points and then pipelines that give people career advancement opportunities and all those things. And those things don't necessarily happen without proper support and nurturing, right? And so that's where we enter in this sort of idea of economic development, and the idea of an intervention is you're saying like, think of the economy as this giant, this giant ship that just is steaming ahead, right? And an economic development agenda is like slowly steering that ship toward the vision and the values and the types of things that we want to see more of in the economy based on our own strengths, our own assets, our own value system in wherever we are living at. It could be a small village or a municipal place, or it could be a large metropolitan region. Doesn't really matter as long as you're trying to steer the economy in that direction that you want to go. And to do that, requires policies that align to those values. It requires programming. It requires the other partners like the capital and all the ecosystem partners that we mentioned, and trying to get all of those partners to align around what's this common vision, because then you're all part of steering that ship, right? It's not just one captain that makes all the shots. You're all saying like, hey, if we do this collaboratively, we can actually steer that ship in a way that's more effective and efficient over time.
That's a great segue into the next really challenging question. The South Island Prosperity Partnership, you guys have been in the works for over a decade, so lots of experience there. And so, how do you get multiple municipalities aligned when they each have their own agendas and maybe their own strategies? How do you actually get those to come together?
Yeah, it's not an easy endeavor, that's for sure. I wish there was an easy answer where you could just like, hey, if you do this, this, and this, everyone will collaborate. Never works that way. But I guess the starting point for me is to think of, what's the proper organizing unit in and of itself for an economy? And I think that's the place where we started here in the South Island. So we're the region of Greater Victoria, which a lot of people who aren't from here, they think of like, oh, it's Victoria. Victoria is Victoria. But it's actually a region of 22 local governments. So we have 13 municipalities and we have 9 First Nations within a metropolitan area of about 400,000 people. And the reason that that's important is that if you look at Stats Canada definition of a metropolitan area or a CMA in Canada, what they're looking at is it's actually the commuter shed. So they're looking at like the spatial relationship between where people live and where they derive their income. And it just happens that the Greater Victoria metropolitan area is a place where people live in one municipality and they might commute and work in another municipality. And so I remember actually years ago when I was working in Saskatchewan, we did some work with this academic named Dr. Mark Partridge, who was at U of S back then, but I think now he's at the University of Ohio, I think. But anyway, he had this criteria where he said, like, you can actually look at your regional economy through this criteria, and there's 4 criteria. And one of them is what I just mentioned. It's the commuter shed. It's that geographical relationship between where you live and where you derive your income. And then you said there's this other one where it's based on human behavior. So that's sort of, where do you buy your groceries? Where do you buy a pair of shoes? Where do you go out for dinner on date night? Where do you take your kids to daycare? Where do you go ride your bike or kayaking or whatever? So that's human behavior type stuff. And there's a geography around that. And the third one is around sort of the trade pattern. It's sort of like, where's that B2B relationship happen? Where's the supplier for the manufacturing facility or whatnot, right? And then the fourth one is what he described as like this natural geography that keeps this, that sort of creates this container for this stuff to happen in. And I happen to live on an island, and so there's a natural connection where people sort of like, you hit the water and you're like, okay, well, I can't buy my groceries in Port Angeles across the border. I'm going to turn around, right? Like there's just like this natural, sometimes it's rivers, sometimes it's mountains, sometimes it's an international border. Like I grew up in Southwest Saskatchewan where, there's the Montana border right there, right? And so if you apply those four criteria, that's sort of the starting point. What we did is we said like, hey, you might be this one municipality in this little part of our metropolitan area, but the way that the economy works is in this broader way where people, it's all much more fluid, right? And that was the starting point we had, is like, hey, when you want to talk about economic interventions and you want to drive the economy, create the wealth that comes into a region, you need to think of that in a broader way. And then, yeah, there's still the Main Street economy. There's still the commercial tax base. There's all the stuff that the municipality has their own control of in their own jurisdiction. And that stuff's just as important as well, because ideally you want to try to align the values of that together. And so we have sort of invited them all into that process and had them lead a lot. So for example, our constitution through the South Island Prosperity Partnership was designed by municipal leaders. So they wrote the bullet points in there. There's 8 bullet points, and it took multiple meetings and many hours to do, and a facilitator, right? Because people are like, oh, I don't like this word here, and that was sort of like a way for us to say, like, wait, we want this thing to reflect your values. Like, you ran for office to make your community better. Here's how, and why we're doing that. And then the other thing we did as a next step to that is we looked at all their official community plans. So all the existing strategies that they had already existing, whether they're formal or, like a position paper or an economic development roadmap, whatever they were. And then we gathered all that stuff together and created an alignment document. And then we went back to them and said, hey, here's all the stuff that you guys already all agree on, right?
All the common denominators, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Shared assets, right, is a great way to collaborate. So in our region, for example, we're the home of Canada's Pacific Navy. That Navy base is in the township of Esquimalt. So it's in one municipality, but that Navy base is huge. They employ 7,000 people around the region. And so that's a shared asset. We can go to all the other municipalities and say, hey, I know it's in Esquimalt. So they're the ones sort of nurturing the pavement and the potholes around it or whatever. But it's a shared asset that we can all agree that is part of our regional economy. And there's many other examples all over Saskatchewan, for example.
Well, that's great, because having you been a person who's lived in Saskatchewan and now you're away, and I know what this is like too, having lived in British Columbia for 15 years and then coming back and looking at my province and seeing all the different things that are going on and that. But from your experience, when you're looking at Saskatchewan, you know, do you think we have functioning ecosystems, or are we still operating like totally more independently?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's very apparent in Saskatchewan is there are a lot of municipalities. So like the RMs and the urban municipalities. BC, I think, has 170 in total with relatively the same land mass, right? And so it is a different type of environment where you are looking at, what you might call a fractured governance type of situation. However, that's not to say that those municipalities can't come together around different, let's call it, like, levels of regional governance around these types of ecosystems, right? And the way that I would think about it is like each one of those municipalities has their own purview of whether it's a urban municipality that has like a town and a built environment and a commercial land base and a main street and a tax base around that. But where the sort of the wealth drivers are coming from are usually probably happening at a larger scale, right? Like a resource industry or a value added, processing facility or something that's down the road that is most likely not in their municipality. And so I think of it like that, as like, if you think about an ecosystem, it's sort of the scale of it changes depending on the type of sector that you're talking about. And I'll use an example just from our backyard. As I remember talking to a CEO of an aerospace company, actually. So we build the de Havilland Twin Otter here in the Victoria area. And the CEO of that company at the time said, like, because we were talking about, hey, is there like an opportunity to do an aerospace cluster in Victoria where, we have a flight school and we have this manufacturing facility and they have some suppliers. And what he said to me, actually, I think about this a lot, is he said our scale of our company is so large that our geography where we get our supplies is like maybe Western Canada at the smallest level. Like, he's like, we get some of our flight components from Florida, it's a global distributed value chain model in the aerospace industry. And so he's like, there's not really a cluster here. Like you can do workforce development and you can do some of the more, you know, checks in a box within the aerospace industry, but the scale of it is much like you need to collaborate all across Canada to make the aerospace industry function. And then, on the flip side of that is you have some of the industries that are much more niche and small, right? Like a bunch of berry producers that are collaborating around, creating a supply agreement with like a larger, like a federated co-op in Saskatchewan, I guess would be a good example, where it takes multiple producers to like create a supply agreement. And so the scale sort of goes up and down depending on the type of sector. And I think in Saskatchewan is that every region in Saskatchewan has their own set of assets and strengths, and to organize around those and build an ecosystem around those is to me is totally possible. It just means thinking creatively too about some of the inputs may come from, like Regina or Saskatoon, and so those partners are need to be invited into your ecosystem rather than just looking at what you have in your backyard.
Would you say some of the gaps that we have then is just not sharing that information or the lack of data across those industries to have a greater kind of feel for our own identity, maybe?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's like one of the things I've been thinking about lately as well is like what are the collaborative governance models themselves that sort of like allow you to be creative and flexible with these things. So rather than thinking about like, oh well, I want to build a I know, like this happened in my hometown in Shaunavon. They wanted to build an ethanol plant, for example. Well, an ethanol plant is a big scaled facility, right? You need economies of scale to make something like that come to fruition, and therefore you need to have a broader set of partners rather than just say one municipality or a couple of municipalities to think much broader. And to do that, you need a governance model that allows you to do that, right? So shared costs, but also shared tax revenue, right? So the facility itself might be in municipality A, and the municipality, B, C, D, and E have an agreement to service that facility that then they also get the tax revenue shared back with them down the line. So that's just, it's creative governance models, I think is a way. And that with that comes the shared strategy, the assets analysis, looking at your asset base and sharing information and sort of what's the vehicle for those partners that may have never collaborated before to actually come together and explore those opportunities. And that's, I think, what groups like SEDA, offer, right? It's like a venue to come, there's no political bias, there's no sector specific bias. You're just coming and saying like, hey, come and have the conversation and then take it from there.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And we do have strong collaboration, absolutely, in our province, but it's I think the kind of one of the questions we definitely want to answer through this is like, what's the one thing that's missing that would help us bring those together? It's sort of, you almost need like the one kind of catalyst to sort of spark things and get them forward. In your experience, what do you think that could be?
Yeah, it's such a good question because it varies, I think, depending on location and context and all that kind of stuff, right? And I don't want to be in this chair of like, hey, I grew up in Saskatchewan. I haven't lived there for about 16 years, and so the context, I'm missing a lot of the context. But I'd say one of the things that I hear when I'm working in the community neighborhood levels, community levels, is they often jump right to capital. And they'll say, "Oh yeah, we'd love to do, this and this and this, but we don't have the capital to do it." And to me, it's very common to do that. But I think the response that I often have is always take an asset based lens from the starting point rather than looking at like, oh well, we wanted to do this big project, but the capital isn't there. Is I always think like, okay, well, what do you have then, right? Like start with the assets that you do have, and there's lots of them already. And I know this from growing up in the prairie region is that they're the most industrious human ingenuity people on earth because they create stuff out of nothing. Literally, the entire province of Saskatchewan was like just a bare grassland, right? And so these communities literally created everything you could see, including the trees where I'm from, but everything came from nothing, and including the cooperative movement in and of itself, where they said, "Hey, we don't have a bank in our small town, so let's just create it ourselves," right? And that's where the co-op and the credit unions came from, right? And so I think that's the approach that we need to sort of get back to is that what's the missing thing, the missing ingredient, I think, is the venue just to come together and have some of these conversations. And then I think the thing I mentioned earlier is just sort of like there's a whole new world emerging around community wealth building models and organizing models and capital stacks and community investment co-ops. And like there's all these vehicles that are emerging that allow the whatever the ideas to happen. And rather than jumping to the capital, like happens time and time again, is like have the conversation of the assets and the shared vision first, and then look at like, hey, now we have all these different options that we can use to actually raise the capital. Maybe the capital doesn't exist for it, but now we have all these emerging community wealth building models and investment co-ops, and there's just all these different creative ways of getting the capital around the good idea once it's formed.
So I guess the idea of, each individual municipality or town or village might have their own strategy and have a greater understanding of themselves and their own identity, but getting them to operate into an ecosystem of, like what you said, of where they're actually going down the road and saying, here's what we have, what do you have? Like,
Yeah.
how do you get that conversation going?
Yeah, and that's I think so something I said earlier where it's like what's the right scale of that aligns to the opportunity that we're talking about? Like, there's the main street economy that's sort of like very insular to the municipality, and they can invest in their own placemaking and beautification and place marketing and things like that. But it's when you get to that next level where you're like, oh, we want to, expand our value added production facilities or something like that, where you want to start building that ecosystem at a broader level. I think one thing that I noticed too when because I grew up on a farm in a small town in Saskatchewan, and there was always this mentality of like, they would refer to Regina as this like distant place where like they're sort of like the adversary, like the government is like against us somehow, and we need to like do it ourselves to sort of survive despite the policymakers and stuff. And I think what I've noticed is that we need to flip that around a little bit and think about like, okay, government may not give you everything you want, but they are a partner. They are part of the ecosystem, and you want to have advocacy for policies that allow your vision to happen. You want them to come to the table as funders or investors, or even on the infrastructure side, the enabling infrastructure. You want their programs around whether it's funding agriculture initiatives or studies or feasibility stuff. And so to see them as part of the ecosystem, even though, yeah, like I grew up 4 hours driving time away from Regina, rather than seeing them as adversaries, see them as part of the solution, and then scale that, like that's the provincial level, and then scale that back to the regional level. Is that a lot of the small towns don't have the economies of scale to, like I said, with the example of the ethanol plant, is there's they don't have the economies of scale to make stuff like that happen, and so you need to broaden that ecosystem and invite the capital partners from an hour away that could play those roles, and the capital investors as well, right? Like the capital is very, especially in the last 3 or 4 decades, capital is very fluid in terms of it'll flow toward ideas no matter where they are on earth. And you're seeing a bit of a counter to that now, where you're seeing people more like, oh, we want to localize our capital and have more control over our assets and invest closer to home and all that kind of stuff. But that's where the creative capital stacks come in, right? Is you can have a local investment model and then invite the other capital as like the last 20% or something, right? That enables the project. It gets you over that tipping point and enables the project to happen. But yeah, in terms of like what's the first step on this, is I think it's sort of just that awareness of that gets the creative juices flowing between and among municipal partners and other partners, chambers of commerce and economic development leaders and stuff that exist across broader geographies, and giving them the venue, places like the SEDA events and stuff like that, where they have this venue to come and just sort of like, hey, let's brainstorm ideas and bring your asset map and your SWOT analysis to those tables and say like, hey, where's all the shared assets that we have that we can actually start to assemble. And of course, like as you mentioned before, Crystal, like the gaps as well, right? Like, hey, we have this and this, but we're missing this fourth ingredient, and then your neighboring jurisdiction or municipality down the road may have that missing ingredient that could form that more ecosystem, that more cohesive ecosystem.
Shifting from the competition idea that we're competing against, you know, our towns or villages, even against our own government. And working towards the collaboration and utilizing the resources that we have that government offers, because they are economic development drivers as well. They want the whole province to succeed. And then, as you said, like sharing the data, sharing your identity, your strat plans with your area,
Yep.
that's kind of moves us out of the competition and into the collaboration.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've had the pleasure in my career to do on several occasions to work in China. And the reason I bring that up is China is doing things at such a massive scale that it's even impossible to describe until you see the type of scale that we're talking about. And when I reflect on like my upbringing in Saskatchewan, is that like the entire province of Saskatchewan is only, 1 million plus people, right? Like the scale of our competitors are worldwide, right? So when we need to think a bit bigger, and to do that requires, yeah, like you can compete in some area, like yeah, I grew up playing hockey, right? Yeah, you're competitors on some realms, right? But when it comes to the economic prosperity of the province, like we're competing against the world. And same in BC, we always say that as well, as like our competitor is not Nanaimo, like 100 kilometers up the island. It's a global world and everyone's trying to attract talent. They're trying to attract capital. We're trying to attract doctors right now in on the island. I think we're the oldest municipality or metropolitan area in Canada, so we need lots
Gonna
more
just
healthcare.
retire in Victoria. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So like that's the type of stuff we're competing for, and so therefore, let's collaborate around attracting those things to our region. Yeah, they might not land in my neighborhood, but it'll land somewhere, and sort of we're all in that together. And that's how I think Saskatchewan, and they've demonstrated that so many times in the past, right? Like just the cooperation models, and the credit union model, and the barn raising, and like I remember when I was a kid, our neighbor, they had a house fire, and like seriously within 3 or 4 days, like all the community came together, and all the kids had like new toys and new clothes and stuff because their stuff was all damaged. And that's the it's already in our spirit, right? In as prairies in the prairies. And so let's just expand that a little bit bigger. And when it comes to economic development and collaborate around ecosystems, absolutely.
Yeah, doing it intentionally instead of, oh, I don't want to say by accident, but I think anytime you put a strategic plan together with intention, you're more likely to get further faster than you are to just sort of fall into opportunity.
Yeah.
Um, in that, yeah.
Yeah. And it has to be deliberate because the collaboration like to do this at these types of scales is very hard, right? Because it's easier to default into our day to day and just go to the council meeting, gotta get the task list done this month, that kind of stuff. And so this bigger picture stuff is much more difficult. And that's why I always tell people like start off with the assets, and like because you get into these rooms where like I had recently where we were planning an agriculture economic development plan, and it was probably like 70% of the meeting was talking about the negative stuff, like, oh, we can't do this, we're missing this, to do this and this requires so much investment that we can't do that. And I was just at the end, we're like, okay, let's just let's turn that switch off for a moment, and like let's assemble the assets. Like we have tons of assets in this space, and then once we get all that organized, we can then say, okay, well, here's some gaps that we need to fill because we've already built this beautiful strength-based asset list that we're building from. And then you start to see like, hey, we have way more partners that need to be in the room than we even thought because we didn't do this brainstorm of all the strengths that we were before we had started.
Yeah. That's exactly it. Kind of nurturing that. It's almost a creative aspect of how to, and as soon as if you start asking anybody about the community and we talk about assets, everybody wants to brag about all the good things they have too. And that just spurs on more ideas about what could actually happen in their community as well. Yeah, really good. So just want to ask three quick little rapid fire kind of questions, really quick, short answers. And that as we kind of move into the closing part. So you've got so much expertise in these areas. Dallas, when we talk about Saskatchewan, what do you think there's one thing that we do really well?
Yeah, when I think of Saskatchewan, I think of human ingenuity, honestly. Like my growing up on a farm, watching my grandpa, he could fix anything, build anything, just the industrious sort of nature of the province. I think that lends itself to a natural entrepreneurial spirit that people just make stuff happen. And I think the more we can fuel and nurture and just show people, like find mentors, find that supportive pathways for these entrepreneurs, and then get them to think bigger. Those are the people that are going to build the future of the province.
Yeah. And what do you think there might be? Is there one thing kind of holding us back right now?
Yeah, my intuition, again with limited context because I haven't lived there in a long time, but I think when it comes to the ingenuity and the passion of the people and stuff like that, is like we need to think at big scales. I think that's one of the keys, is to think at a bigger scale without getting into that headspace of like, oh, I can't think of that scale because all these things are missing, right? Capital's missing, partners are missing, can't do that, right? And so that's the magic sauce, right? Is like, how do we think bigger and scale up without being locked out of our own, based on our own mindset of like all the gaps and what's missing? And I think that's the biggest opportunity for Saskatchewan. Add more, like think value add. We used to have this saying growing up in Saskatchewan that for every, I think it was Paul Martin that coined this phrase, but for every rail car full of grain, you just put a young person on the top and ship them out of the province with it. And it was
Mhm.
sort of this idea of like, why aren't we adding value to things as much, right? And we have the same problem in BC too. But just think about value add and scale. Like, what's the right scale to add value across all these different sectors and industries that we have and assets that we have?
Yeah. And last little quick question. If Saskatchewan was to have one big bold move over the next 12 months, in your expertise, what do you think that would be that would really start us on that pathway?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting right now watching the landscape play out in the world right now with the geopolitics, right? The stuff with the tariffs and like the new world order, as the prime minister's coined, and watching that play out, thinking about like Canada as a resource economy. And I think that's a flawed, actually, mindset to have, is that in order to develop an economy, you have to only think about resources and big projects and big major things. I think that's actually a little bit of a flawed model, because what it does is it puts us in this sort of like nanny state position where you're like, oh, I have to go like beg Prime Minister Carney for money to invest in my province and in my project and my infrastructure. And I think the opposite is actually what's going to change, what's going to give us, and that's like looking at local sovereignty, local control, local scale, local investment, keeping more wealth in our regions, in our communities, in our province. And to do that, we need to do it. We need to like take ownership ourselves, and that's where I think to go full circle in this conversation, that's where we need an ecosystem approach. Is like we need to bring our own leaders, our own entrepreneurs, our own investment models together in our own regions and build that for ourselves. And yeah, if there's investment from the federal and the provincial government that like accelerates that, and but it's on our terms, right? In that case, right? Rather than sort of begging and hoping Ottawa sees our big opportunity to invest. And but I think that's a much more empowering position to be. It's also a much more narrative position when you talk about like getting young people to stay in the province, is like, rather than saying like, oh, I hope Ottawa invests in our province so we can do A, B, and C. It's more like, no, I hope that we can build our own future. I think that's the biggest opportunity, is like once you start to see those creative capital stacks and local wealth production, we start to think much more entrepreneurial and then much more ambitiously around the right scales to actualize that.
Exactly. Exactly. Instead of waiting for somebody to write you a check, we create our own path, our own future, and all the opportunities that come with that. That are part of our own identity, what we offer specifically here that makes Saskatchewan so unique, which would be different than what you have in Victoria area, right? Obviously.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's been great conversation that we've had, Dallas. We've covered lots of things, and I really thank you for sharing your experiences and your expertise on this. And yeah, really appreciate the time that you spent with me today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and I love Saskatchewan and have so much affection for the people and the values there. So I'm happy to be involved. Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks so much, Dallas. Wow, a sincere thank you to Dallas Gislason, Executive Director of the South Island Prosperity Partnership in British Columbia, for sharing his expertise and the incredible work being done to build one of Canada's leading economic ecosystems. And there was a lot to unpack in that conversation, but I hope it leaves you with one important takeaway, that strong regional economies don't happen by accident. They happen when communities, businesses, governments, educational institutions, Indigenous partners, and organizations choose to work together with intention around a shared vision they create. Saskatchewan is already moving in that direction, and conversations like this help us to learn from successful models and think differently about how we can strengthen our own regions and remain competitive in a rapidly changing economy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Path to Prosperity, share it with your colleagues, elected officials, and community leaders, and help us keep these important conversations going. To explore more of our podcast episodes, thought leadership, and practical resources from the Saskatchewan Economic Development Alliance, just visit SEDA.ca. I'm Crystal Froese, and thanks for listening.